Thanks for everyone for joining us today. So what we're going to do is we have a Q&A and we're going to talk about SEO strategy. So to introduce ourselves, so I'm Kevin Gibbons, I'm CEO and founder of Precis Digital, and we're a strategy-driven SEO agency. And I'm talking alongside Christian.
Hi, I'm Christian Möllerström. I'm a managing partner at Precis. We're a data-driven performance agency.
And we've got a very quick agenda that we're going to share with you in terms of questions that we've got lined up. And outside of that, we'd like to invite you to ask your own questions as well. So there's a Q&A function and a chat function within Zoom. So feel free to leave your questions in there, probably in the Q&A. And then we'll pick them up as they come in, and we'll make sure that we're answering any challenges that you have yourself around kind of SEO and strategy in particular. So the agenda we have is kind of, why do I need strategic SEO? We're going to dig into some real world examples. We're going to look at a trial and error approach. And then there's 3 components of organic growth that we're going to finish up on as well. So yeah, thanks to everyone. And I'm not sharing my screen, am I? I just realized that. I'm reading off the slides, and to be honest, I've told everyone anyway. So I won't share my screen, and let's just go straight over to Christian.
Fantastic, thanks Kevin. So I can see the participants are starting to trickle in, and we'll get started then. The first topic of today is why strategic SEO, and we'll set the scene a little bit here. So in my work, I focus on paid advertising channels. We at our organization, we've certainly touched on SEO and we've run various technical projects. So I wanted to contrast that with strategic SEO. Can you tell us a little bit about why would I or a company need strategic SEO, and when do I know I'll need it?
So I'll answer this in a couple of ways, but I think the first answer to this is, firstly, why do you need it? The answer to that question isn't always yes, you do. It's understanding, where do your customers come from and how do they find you? And is organic search a large channel behind that? And similar that I'm sure you would find on the paid search side, that actually for some brands, search is incredibly important. That's how they find their customers. In other industries, it might not be as important. On the whole, I would say when we work with certainly B2C brands, we find more often than not, organic search can be 50%, even 75% of traffic, and quite often similar numbers in revenue. But the first question is actually, from a marketing perspective, what is it that's working for you? And then how do you work backwards in terms of prioritization? If organic search is incredibly important, which, like I say, in most cases it is, but it should be based on the data as opposed to an assumption. The strategy part then becomes, okay, well, what is it that's working? And then how do we get more of that? So it's looking at how can you expand upon what type of keywords people are searching for? How do you improve that performance? And I would always take that as the first step. How do we get more of what we have already? And then how do you start to explore, okay, well, these are our customers. What else are they searching for? What type of content would resonate with them? And what are the trends and topics that people are looking for afterwards? And then that builds into more of a strategic approach on how you can think about the customer in their shoes, and then form a strategy about how you can target them in the right places at different stages of the journey.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I want to focus a little bit more about, what does that mean for business goals? I think to a lot of people, the idea of strategic SEO might feel quite abstract.
Yep.
If you're talking about technical SEO, there are very clear practical things you're doing or implementing that will, in some instances, have immediate or very short-term results. So let's focus then on aligning with business goals. Mm-hmm. Can you give me a few examples or use cases of how and when a strategic SEO plan was created?
Yeah, I think with the business goals is really important. I ask a lot of questions that I think sometimes they might surprise people on the client and the brand side, because I don't think everyone does this. But for me, I would really dig into where do their customers come from, who are they, how do they convert, and then it's typically that approach of I quite like the why, how, what Simon Sinek way of framing that conversation. So firstly, you look at why it's important, and normally it's because it's a key revenue driving channel, and then you look into what is it that's making them money, and that turns into, that's kind of more the how. So what type of keywords are they searching for, how well is that converting, and then the what becomes more of the strategy of what you would do afterwards, which we can certainly dig into. But I think from the business perspective, what I do find with SEO is sometimes people can measure what's easiest and not what's most important. And what I mean by that is, if you take analytics, for example, it's only as good as how you set it up. So if you set this up aligned with your business goals, where you're tracking revenue for all of your marketing channels, and it's accurate and you know what's coming through, then it should work very well. But actually, if it's not, and you're basing your performance of success on what rankings have we got, or how many links have we acquired, etc., that's how you do it, but it's not why you do it. So I think the key thing is always alignment. It's understanding where does that client want to get to. And again, I try and turn any short-term conversation into a longer-term one. So where do they want to be in 12 months, 3 years, 5 years? And then how do you work backwards to make that happen? And then I feel like you're having the more strategic conversation first, and tactically, how you're going to get there is going to change. You're not going to have a 5-year plan that goes perfectly 100% to plan. That doesn't happen in business, life, and certainly not SEO. But there's actually a guy who's a mentor of mine, Mike Lander, and he always says, don't complain about where you end up. If you don't know where you're going, don't complain about where you end up. And I think that's exactly the way I would approach SEO. If you have that plan and you know where you want to get to, when stuff happens that gets in the way, you have, and I'm looking at this almost from an entrepreneurial mindset, but I think this works from SEO as well. If you hit a wall, well, you can either bounce back out and give up, or you can find a way around it, over it, through it. And my approach is always to find a way around it, through it, or over it. So I think from an SEO perspective, as long as you have that goal in mind, you can then always work backwards to that. The strategy, and certainly from a tactical perspective, may change, but that alignment in goals is really, really key. And again, it doesn't mean that you set a goal and forget about it. You reassess and you make sure that that's realistic. But if you don't have a bigger picture to aim towards, it's so easy to get sidetracked, especially in SEO, because we have, for example, we have a Slack channel for in-house SEO brands, and there's often, on average, you might get 5 to 10 stories a day that these are just filtering out the ones that we think we should be reading. There's so much content and information and algorithm changes all of the time. You can easily get distracted by the shiny new object. So I think going back to that original question, having alignment in your goals is just absolutely crucial, because then it brings you back to what's most important.
I think that's an error I've made quite often, where I've always worked on the assumption, and bear in mind, I'm not an SEO specialist, so that's probably why I've made this error, that you've got your key components of SEO, you build there, you do what you're supposed to be doing, you follow some best practices, and voila, the end result is an SEO strategy that will automatically take you to where you're going. And what you've just described is effectively, you begin with the end. In a way, you figure out where you want to end up or where you want to go, and you work backwards from there. And I've never approached it in that way. And one thing that makes me think about is, what does success then look like? It's the reason I'm thinking about this is that Forrester, the research company, they recently released a paper where they analyzed the selection criteria that companies use when selecting an agency or a partner. And one of the key insights they highlighted was that due to the COVID pandemic, brands now more than ever need agencies or partners who can demonstrate a clear impact on results. paraphrase, they need to be able to demonstrate that this is where you want to end up, and this is how we're delivering on that right now and ongoing. And that's got me thinking quite a lot about what you've just said, but also about evaluation, about performance models and SEO. So if you understand where you want to end up and you work back from there, how do you then evaluate that? Because I think about performance evaluation when I think about SEO, something I think about a lot when I think about PPC, data-driven performance marketing, and paid marketing channels. But what does or should performance evaluation look like for SEO?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. I think I'll start by answering your earlier point, which I do think it's typical. People start with, let's say, an SEO audit, and from the audit, here's all the issues, go away and fix them. That's quite overwhelming, especially if you've got a document of, here's 50 things, now this is on your plate, go away and do it. And I just don't feel like that's the best way of working with clients anymore. And I think the way I would propose this should work is actually, how do you start with the opportunity? In fact, I will do a screen share at this point, because there's something that I think helps to answer that question a little bit more clearly. And this will lead into what we're saying about performance models. But my way of looking at this is very much, you start with the opportunity. Otherwise, why should you be investing in SEO if you don't know what it's worth? And there's various benchmarks you can do against past performance, competitor performance, market size, etc., to understand what that looks like, certainly at top level. You then build that into the SEO strategy. So you look at a range of top level reasons why you could be performing well or underperforming. And then that goes into the action plan. So you have kind of technical SEO, on-site content production, and digital PR campaigns, a link reputation that you're doing to improve performance. And ultimately, it's measured by the organic performance that you drive. And I think that's the key thing, is it starts with the strategy. So you understand what it is that you're going to do to move the needle. You don't start with the issues, because issues are rarely prioritized in the right way. I'm just going to bring that back, so stop screen sharing. So I think that answers almost like the first part of what you were saying. On the performance model, why I think that's so important is because without it, what are you measuring? If your plan is, let's find a load of issues and then let's fix them, surely the measurement is, have you fixed those issues? Because that's what you're doing. Whereas if you start with the opportunity and strategy, what you're trying to achieve is ideally as tied closely as possible to business goals. How do you drive organic revenue growth? That's the way I would like to do it. If you can't get down to organic revenue, how do you drive leads and maybe put a valuation on average lead value, average customer value, etc. But once you know that, then there becomes an alignment in what you're targeting. And I feel like these are the types of conversations I much prefer to have. It's, how do we help you grow the business by a certain percentage, as opposed to how do we get you X amount of links, or how do we improve technical issues, but from Z down to Y, or etc. So once you know what's possible, and I think there's a couple of aspects to this. One is, what's the client's expectation and goal? Two is, based on your research and insight, what do you think is achievable? If a client comes to you and says, we want to grow by 100% next year, the answer is typically, don't we all? And it's got to be, I mean, that might be a realistic expectation, but you have to back it up with data. You have to say, okay, well, based on the market and everything that you're throwing at it in terms of your own activity and speed that you're moving, we do think that's achievable. But you want to be able to be in a position where you can firstly forecast what that success looks like. And if you can do that and you're confident on it, that's when you can look at performance models. There's a few things to throw in there. I guess firstly, look at this purely from a client side as opposed to an agency. If you're not confident on those numbers, why should you go into that engagement? Because you really want both sides to go into any relationship wanting it to work. Otherwise, what's the point? And I think if you're in that situation, which you should be, and if you're not, maybe you shouldn't be, then you can look at performance models to share the risk and reward. And what I find as a general rule with these things is trying to find something that's 100% perfect never works. Trying to find something that is fair and it's better than a fixed rate time and materials, I think is what you're trying to get to. So what you're really looking to achieve is the end results. How much you pay per day or per deliverable is not really why you're doing it. Again, that's back to the how. So I think the key here is how do we set a top line expectation on what's been achieved as a KPI? And then how do you share that risk and reward? In my experience, I think there's a hybrid model that probably works best, where you have, this is what we will deliver, here's the price. And then you might have a percentage of an agreement that is set to a KPI. So if we underachieve, maybe there's a consequence of that. And if we overachieve, there's a bonus behind it. So I think that way, from the client side, they can see we're aligned together. And there's a very popular consultant called Blair Enns, who, in his words, you're not in a partnership unless you've got skin in the game. So every agency calls himself a partner, but the true meaning of the word partnership is that you both have something to win and lose together, and you're both aligned in trying to put everything behind winning. And there's a consequence that will affect both of you if you don't win. And I think that's very fair in this situation. Otherwise, if it's a one-sided relationship, then it doesn't feel like losing is as painful for both sides, and winning is shared successfully on both sides. So I think, again, alignment in the goals is really key. And then if you can track it back to that and have a risk and reward model from a performance perspective, I don't think this works in every single case, but I think if you can get there, it's a very nice place to be in terms of just showing that you're on the same team, you're focusing in the same direction, and trying to then have a fair compensation model at the end of it.
You've actually answered the question that I was going to immediately ask you, which is, if you start with the end and then work down from there, how do you ensure you're innovating and you're actually being ambitious and pushing forward? And I think you've answered that by having skin in the game, both partners in the true sense of the word have an incentive to keep pushing that forward and to always do better. So you've already answered that question, which is really good.
One thing I would add on that actually is I think innovation can be a scary word for a lot of people. And I think of innovation as it's continually improving. So I think you're right in the sense of, if you're getting results, that's likely being innovative, because what you're doing is what's working. To me, where innovation is a bad example is when you don't innovate and you don't get results. So if you're staying top of your game, you're sharp and it's working and it's achieving your goals, there's a good chance that you are innovating in order to achieve that, because everything changes and you have to improve. But yeah, I think the downside is you're too rigid, and you did what used to work 3 years ago and you're still doing it today, following it to the letter, and surprise, surprise, it no longer works.
I think you're touching on two areas there that I'd like to know a bit more about. It's, what are you doing to kind of push forward, to innovate, or to move? What are you focusing on, the components of SEO, if you will? And also, how are you learning, or how are you progressing? So let's start with the components. In the slide you showed a little bit earlier, there were 3 aspects or pillars of SEO, so to speak. Can you tell us a little bit more about what they are and how they work?
Yes, so I try and keep everything as simple as I can from an SEO perspective. And I got involved in SEO in 2003, which was kind of the infancy of SEO when you think Google was in 98 in terms of their launch. Back then, I would say the reason that we did SEO was to make clients' sites make more money through search. And the 3 things that we did, number 1 was improve technical SEO, so making the site more accessible to search engines. Number two, on-site content. So you have to have content that people are searching for. Otherwise, if they're searching for that and you don't have content, they're not going to find you. And number three is that brand's authority and reputation. So that's evolved a lot from kind of link building and maybe even manipulation tactics kind of in the early days into a much more rounded PR brand approach of, kind of how do you be the authority that deserves to rank. But those three components in terms of technical SEO, on-site content and link reputation, although everything has changed tactically and will always change tactically, those three fundamentals have always remained in place. And those are the three key things that if you have a weakness on one of those, that's where I would advise focusing on. And I think for me, that whole strategic approach is you don't have kind of any preconceived ideas around let's go away and create content, build links or improve technical SEO. You look at where your strengths and weaknesses are first and foremost, and then you try and plug in the gaps as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I would say that the technical SEO aspect is the one that's often the clearest to me. I think that's the easiest to compare when you're coming from a PPC background, and I'm very guilty of that.
Yeah.
But taking all three into consideration, let's talk a little bit more about how you improve in them. So it's like, I imagine they're not really set and forget kind of projects or initiatives. You've already mentioned that tactically they've changed enormously since 2003. Right. So by comparison, a lot of what I've learned when I work with digital marketing is through testing, it's through trial and error.
Yep.
How does that work for SEO?
So our approach that I can talk you through, and again, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer in this. I think there's just different ways that people approach it. But I like to have a long-term aim that we're working towards so that we don't get distracted from what does success look like, going back to the original questions. But then there's a balance of how do you test and learn and experiment with what you're doing along the ways. So you could find that the way we do this is in quarterly sprints. So we have quarterly business reviews with each of our clients that are from a top level performance perspective. How have you performed? What have we delivered? What is it that we're doing next? And I'd always look at how do we bring something in there that's new? And here's an idea that we want to experiment with. And I think you need to be prepared that actually some of the things you're going to try will fail because you're trying them, you're testing it. If it's untested, it's not guaranteed that it's going to work. In SEO, we put quite a lot of time in voice search, probably about 18 months ago, because it appeared that this is going to grow significantly and it's going to be a big thing from an SEO perspective. And I would say we've backtracked a little bit from that, certainly in terms of the focus, but at the same time, I don't think that means we shouldn't have looked at it in the first place, because you need to be aware of what's coming next. Otherwise, if you completely miss it, or wait until it's popular, you're too late. So I think there's that balance of, I've always quite liked the concept of how do you take maybe 5 to 10% of your effort, a bit like kind of almost like Google's R&D time, if you like, but how do you take that to experiments and understand what it is that's working outside of your day-to-day activity. And then if you can find that works, from an agency perspective, it could be that you have your own website or your own projects that you can experiment with. SEO can be a little bit about pushing the boundaries on what works and what doesn't work. But if you can find from your own experiments what the next thing is, then you can start to roll that out to clients if it's successful and a good fit. So I think you always need that element of, here's the bigger picture. Let's not get too distracted by anything else. This is where we're going. Let's make it happen. But at the same time, let's not forget everything else that's changing all the time. We still want to stay on top of our game, read information, attend conferences, speak at conferences, etc. And I think that helps us to stay sharp, but that focus alongside understanding what's changing and being agile and testing a small amount of things on a small scale, and And I always quite like the model of kind of just start small, aim big. So how do you test something, see how that works? And it could be you're doing SEO to one page on a website, or maybe like a small category of pages, running a controlled experiment, seeing how that reacts. And if it's successful, you've then built a business case that you can do it more heavily. And certainly with bigger brands, if you go in there and say, we want to change big site-wide changes, it's not that easy. There's a lot of technical resource and cost that goes into making those changes. So I think having that experimentation approach alongside the tried and tested plan, certainly from our perspective, allows us to stay on the right track, but agile enough to adapt if we need to.
You touched on two things there that I think are quite interesting. One, you mentioned that, it's a resource investment. It can be a big undertaking.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned start small but aim big.
Mm-hmm. So
everything you've described today, it's a comprehensive plan. You set the strategy, you think about where you want to go, and you work backwards from there. You measure what success means, what it is, and ideally build some kind of performance model on top of that.
Yep.
And you need to keep an active eye on those three pillars you identify. But that's, as I said, that's quite comprehensive. That's a lot of work. So
it is.
That's intimidating, I think, for a lot of people and for a lot of businesses.
Yep.
Why should I bother? Why shouldn't I just focus on the low-hanging fruit and stay in that more comfortable area, so to speak?
So I think there's a right way and a wrong way to focus on the low-hanging fruit. I think the wrong way, and I think people might disagree with me on this, but I think the wrong way is to jump in and fix issues. And the reason I say that is because if you don't know what you're trying to achieve from a business perspective, actually, are you fixing the right issue in the first place? Sometimes it can be like the whole rearranging of the chairs on the Titanic, as opposed to I always like to think bigger picture first. So I think if the right way of doing that would be, okay, this sounds overwhelming, let's break it down. So one example is we did a lot of work with Expedia and have done over the years. And we found that if we're making changes to expedia.co.uk alongside a large in-house team, other agencies, and then not to mention TV advertising, all of their other channels, etc. If we make changes to their website, how does that impact the overall website's performance? And honestly, I think it's very hard, if not impossible, to answer that question. What we found was a much better approach is we then looked at, okay, well, based on your overall website, you have key lines of businesses. So you have hotels, flights, car hire, packages, etc. Why don't we take one of those? And this is what we did. We optimized a number of pages that we saw within car hire that were ranking on page 2 or page 3. We knew that the opportunity, if we were to tip that over to the edge on page 1, would generate a lot more traffic. And we focused our efforts on a very specific keyword group within car hire. And we proved that what we did by making on-site optimization changes, technical, and some work around boosting their link reputation to that section of the site, we could then prove that our work was performing incredibly well because you can silo it. So the level of effort that went into that, because you're not talking enterprise scale, or you're just talking one silo of that, it's much easier to measure. And then you've got a business case that says, actually, we do want to do this at an enterprise level, but we've now proved that it works and we've built a case and we know how to make it happen. And it's less overwhelming, and it's certainly much more compelling if you can say, this is our case. So in this, we've got a very nice case study from this, which shows, I think it was kind of 35, 40% growth in organic transactions. And the thing that we really liked from this, certainly from internally within the business, was that section or line of business outperformed the site average by 180%. So it's really pinpointing, this is what we've done specifically for that section of the site. It's worked. Now let's do it. Kind of roll it out more heavily. Whereas if you start with let's roll it out more heavily, it's a giant leap of faith. So you need a lot of confidence in order to say, okay, well, yeah, let's go for it. So I think that goes back to the starting small, aiming big, prove it works, do more of it. And yeah, typically I think that was a very impressive result from our perspective. It allowed us to grow.
You mentioned something there. It's a giant leap of faith. And in my past conversations with you and with other SEO specialists, that's something that's echoed below. It's a giant leap of faith. In other words, how do you get buy-in on the board level or C-level for something like this? How do you approach that?
So I think SEO is underrepresented at the board level, and I think there's a couple of reasons for it. And I actually think this is more of a failing on the SEO side than it is the board level side. And I say that for the reason that I think on the board level, people quite often think as organic traffic is free, and it's not. I always say that SEO is your biggest priority once it goes wrong. And it's kind of like, I see this time and time again. The clients that come to us because they've been hit by a penalty or they might have just gradually lost market share, but it's no longer working to the point that it's costing them a lot of money. It's then on the board agenda because they can see the impact largely from what they lost, and they kind of take for granted what they had before. And now it's disappeared. They want to do something about it to get it back. And I think it's a failing from the SEO perspective quite often because the metrics of success, I feel, are quite often too tactical. So we've improved. It could even be like rankings and visibility are a good example, where I think if you're at a board level, you would say, so what? It's like, it's nice to be maybe improving your organic market share against competitors is nice at a marketing level. At a board level, you want to be making money. So you have to be showing that this is really working. And I think that's where it all ties back to kind of our overall conversation of alignment with business goals, forecasting on what's expected, alignment within potentially performance models and how you work so that you do have skin in the game. And if you want to get more trust from the board, I think you have to be seen as a partner. You're not, again, another analogy here that I quite like is you're not there as a waiter, because a waiter just takes orders and gives you what you want. And what you should be is a strategic partner. You actually want to be invited to sit at the table. And I think to do that at the board level within SEO, the only way you can get invited to that table is if you talk about money and if you talk about the revenue impact that you're generating to that business. Otherwise, why should they care? They've got much more important things to worry about than the number of errors that they have in Google Search Console. That is not a CEO's job. It's it's an SEO's job. So I think that's the thing. To take it from SEO to CEO, you have to speak their language, and money talks, essentially.
Thanks for that, Kevin. I think you've answered a lot of the questions I've been thinking of in preparation for this Q&A. I'd like to encourage any participants who want to add some questions to the Q&A. I see you've already got some in, but we also got some questions sent in advance that I'd like to quickly cover. So one of the ones stated that, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but PPC, it's an always-on kind of work in many instances. It's a continuous cycle of weekly check-ins, monthly meetings, and QBRs, because you're always moving forward. You're always delivering more revenue, more leads, and so forth.
Yep.
You've talked a lot today about, and this is my part of the question, you've talked a lot today about things that I feel are relevant to that. So, you know, it's about setting a strategic plan, a long-term plan. If PPC is always on, what does that look like for SEO?
I think it's similar. I think you have, with SEO, things change all the time. So I always say to clients that what we're facing is a moving target. So quite often people will say, okay, we're number 3 in the market, we want to get to number 1. Therefore, and they quite logically work out, this is what this brand is doing. You might even have metrics behind it. They've published X amount of pieces of content. Their link reputation is 86 out of 100. Their page speed is X, et cetera, et cetera. And what I always remind them is, to be honest, that's a good start. That's a good audit, and you know where you are, but it's not necessarily where they're going to be in 12 months' time. So if you're talking about where you want to be in 12 months' time, you can't assume that your competitors are doing nothing, because it's a moving target and they're changing their strategy and approach alongside what you're doing. So I think that's an important point here. I don't know if you've read this, but another Simon Sinek book, his latest one, is The Infinite Game. And I think that relates, he's talking about running businesses as a lot of businesses think of this as a finite state of, you want to improve shareholder value, etc. And it's kind of like a short-term focus on how do you make those short-term actions that help people to achieve their goals. Maybe it's quarterly, annually, but it's not normally looking into the long-term future. And I think business quite often is more an infinite game. There's SEO is a good example of this. There's no such thing as won or lost. It's winning and losing. And how do you then take that to improve? Like, there's very competitive spaces in SEO. The most competitive, I would say, in the UK is probably around car insurance as a single phrase. And I know that phrase in particular is worth a lot of money in terms of both top line revenue and bottom line profit, just as a difference between being number one and number two. And you're in a market where there's competitors that are very strong. They know exactly what they're doing and they're throwing absolutely everything at it. If you give up, or if you say, and this is probably the worst position to be in, if you're number one, your only way is down. So from that position, sometimes you can become risk averse and you can say, okay, we're number one, so we don't want to change too much because we want to protect what we have. But at the same time, if you've got someone else that is aggressively fighting to replace you, and you're potentially not doing that much because you just want to stay where you are, you have to have a lot of activity just to stand still. So I think there's a lot of components, but it is an always on approach, and you have to always be moving forward and striving to innovate. And I think there's different levels that you're at. I think there's one or two states that you're in terms of SEO, you're either market leader or you're trying to catch someone. So if you're trying to catch someone, that's potentially where you're looking at the big changes. What's the thing that's really going to move the needle? If you're number one, that's probably when you're going to look at the small marginal gains. How do we make this slightly better? How do we improve our meta description so that we can improve the click-through rate? And actually there's a nice kind of integration with SEO and PPC there that you can obviously leverage data from. But I think it doesn't mean that you give up. Certainly, you definitely don't rest on your laurels. You have to keep pushing and improving, even if you are number one, because in that position, then you're not safe at all. Even if you're doing stuff, you're not safe. So you have to be always looking at how you can take that next step and keep growing, essentially.
I think that's probably the quote of the day. You're either the market leader or you're trying to catch up. I like that.
Yeah.
The next question we got sent in, I feel you've already answered a lot of this, but I did want to see if there's anything more you want to say about it. So in past conversations with their clients, their clients have complained that SEO and PPC agencies haven't adapted to this company's metrics for success.
Yep.
What's your opinion on that?
I think you have to adapt to the company's metrics of success, but that's a two-way conversation as well. I think the first conversation is, how do you align with those metrics in the first case? And I think this is when I feel like my strength is the combination of SEO and running a business. And that means that I would look at commercially, what are we trying to achieve from an SEO perspective? And then how do we communicate that with our clients? The two-way side of that conversation is stuff will change. Targets will change, but also the priorities within the business will change. And you need to be receptive to understanding that. For us, the QBRs as a check-in, I found have been very powerful, because then we get to understand more about top level, what the clients are doing. Sometimes it's working alongside that client as well. I've had a number of clients in the past, maybe when I was probably more hands-on with SEO, that I've quite often worked from our office, and I think just by being in the office, I've figured out stuff that the client wouldn't have thought important enough to tell me in a meeting, but just by being there around them, I'm kind of like, this is really important. Why didn't you ever tell us this before? And the other answer from their side will often be, you never asked us. So it's like it's not a blame game on either side. It's just, how do you bring together that information? And I think the more that you can do that and align yourself, and then realignment, I think, is important, which, yeah, like I say, the QBRs, I think, are a good place for that. I think that's the good place to be. I find the challenges on the flip side, and this is probably why I focus on business alignment so much, is learning from failures. Early on in my career, I'd imagine every SEO has had this type of conversation, but you'll walk into a meeting, we're prepared, everything's going really well, we fixed a load of issues, rankings are up, traffic's up, etc. And the client is really disappointed, maybe even angry. And the reason behind that is they look at all of your metrics and they just ask, so what? And they ask, so what, because it doesn't relate to the business. If you're making them money, I would say generally they're happy. They should be. But if you're making them rankings and numbers on your spreadsheet are going up, do they care? Only if it's going to make them money. So I think that's the thing, that alignment, I think, is just absolutely crucial.
Great, thanks. Let's take a quick look at the questions that were sent in through Q&A. So the first one, Chris Wyatt asks, you talked about voice. What are the next key things on the horizon people and businesses should be mindful of or keep an eye out for?
So in one way, I feel like answering that by saying, if I knew that for sure, I'd be a billionaire. I would be investing money in the stock market on the next big thing if I knew that answer to the question. But that said, I think I'll talk to you about it, how I would approach it. And to me, it's keeping your eye open into things. I remember at least 5 years ago in Vegas seeing a presentation by Robert Scoble on, it was to do with, I've gone blank on, virtual reality and augmented reality. And I asked him at the end, like, what would you do from a agency perspective, certainly a search agency? And I remember he answered the question by saying, okay, well, we're in Vegas. If you've just got here and you want to understand where to go tonight, you can literally talk to your headset and say, which restaurants, which bars, which clubs do you want to go to? And then you can see the visualization of that as if you're in the room. And I actually thought that was quite exciting. Like, okay, well, I don't get all of the hype around virtual reality, but that sounds quite useful. If you're somewhere new and you want to experience it to make a decision out of, I don't know, 4 or 5 places of where to go that evening, it sounds like a good thing to do. And I think for me, looking back now, virtual reality certainly doesn't appear to have taken off in the way it certainly was predicted back then. It doesn't mean that it won't, but what they were predicting would happen over the next couple of years certainly hasn't happened. Voice search, I think, is very popular within the home, but the threats of voice search taking away desktop and mobile search is also not there. So that said, I don't think it's a waste of time to be looking into those things. I think being aware of it is good, because it challenges you to think in different ways that you wouldn't do normally. What I would say is my learning of looking at this from 16, 17 years, I guess, of being in the industry, is when you look back over years, decades of trends, you start to see some clearer themes. And for me, those themes have been, you can chase Google's algorithm and you can look at what's coming next, and you can understand this is the next thing I should be testing. And those small marginal gains might come from that, but I don't think the big wins come from there. The big wins come from the trends. The big trends, if I look over the last 10 to 15 years, have been user behaviors. So it's people are now using their mobile much more frequently. Therefore, Google is going to push mobile first indexing. They're going to make sure that your page speed is strong, because if you're on a mobile, then it's even more important that you have a fast experience. Those are the big trends that I think are the ones that have a real impact. And I would suggest when you look at things from a annual strategy, you're probably more focused on the big trends. When you look at things from a quarterly experimental, what are we going to test because we think this might be a good thing to look at? That's when you look at the kind of up and coming trends, Google's latest algorithm updates. You still keep a pulse in the industry, but you have to filter that information. Otherwise, you're always in reactive mode, and you could make a change every day based on what you read in the industry, if not 10 or 100. So you've got to filter that information and then make your own decisions.
Thanks. I think that's I like your concept there about like following the trends as opposed to chasing the algorithm.
Yeah.
I definitely think that's something that where I can draw a lot of parallels to PPC and paid marketing as well. That you need to look at user behavior and user trends before you look at platform trends, or in this case, search algorithm, for instance.
Exactly. And I still find, as much as everyone loves to talk about the advanced side of SEO and the new things, I still see a lot of the basics going wrong. And possibly the same with PPC, of actually how many marketers buy the product from their client. And that's something that I make sure that if it's e-commerce, for example, we go through like that whole shopping cart experience, because otherwise, if you don't understand from their customer's perspective, sometimes there's fundamental issues behind that. And I'm not even talking about how do we help conversion rate optimization, but how do you understand what it is they're looking for, what type of language do they use when it comes to keywords, but understanding more about the overall experience and how it fits in. And I think once you take the time to do that, there's potentially more learnings in fixing the basics and the things that are wrong that shouldn't be wrong, before you can even move on to the more tactical, kind of exciting in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think those innovative things are great to try, and I definitely advocate that you do that. But I would also say make sure you haven't forgotten the fundamentals, because they can be overlooked sometimes because they're so obvious, but often that's where a lot of the issues and the quicker wins can lie as well.
I think that's a very good segue to the last question of the day. You've spoken a lot about errors that maybe SEO specialists or agencies are making, but another question we got sent in was, what are the biggest or most common mistakes you see businesses fail at when talking about SEO?
I think we've touched on this already, but I think short-termism. I think people are always thinking about, where do we want to be at the end of the quarter? How do we make, if you want to make anything a great success, it's not going to happen overnight. Even like when you look at companies, are a good example of, everyone thinks every new company they hear of is an overnight success, and actually most of them have been around for 10 years or more. It's just you would never have heard of them for the 9 years when they weren't that popular, but it doesn't mean that they haven't gone through that trial and error and learning curve to get to where they are. And I think with SEO, it's the same. And I think this is, again, not a blame on the client side. There's two sides to this. The client side, I think you need more patience. And I think patience comes with alignment in the business goals. If I'm going to tell you I'm going to fix technical errors and get you links, I think you should quite rightfully say, okay, well, I want you to do that this month or over the next 3 months. If I'm going to tell you I'm going to triple your revenue, I would expect you to have a bit more patience over the time frame in which I'm going to achieve that. So I think that how you frame that conversation and maybe change that conversation is really important, so that you can focus on the longer term objectives. But otherwise, I do think short-termism is an issue of, you're always chasing what feels like the next best short-term goal. But I always quite like to draw this out as, you can either go through quarterly spikes all the time, but that spike dips and then you're back to square one, starting all over again. Or you can gradually, slow and steady, kind of grow on what you have already. And it's almost like that compound interest effect of how do you take where you are right now. You still have those check-ins to show that you're keeping progress, but it's against the bigger picture goals, not the spikes. So yeah, the biggest issues that I see are certainly from a strategy perspective, alignment and goals, realistic expectations on how long it's going to take. Also the resources it's going to take to make that happen as well, because it has to align. You can have lofty ambitions, but if you've got one part-time person and no dev resource, then it's clearly, and especially if you're up against, say, like a multi-million pound competitor with big budgets, it's not going to be something that you're going to be able to win very easily. So resourcing is another big issue that we always face. Certainly in-house SEO teams have a lot of struggles with, often they know what to do. Getting it signed off and getting it pushed through can be a challenge. And again, with a business hat on, I would advocate build a business case and show the real value behind what you're doing. Don't just give a developer a list of changes that means nothing to them. Try and actually get them involved and excited about what they're doing and why they're doing it. But yeah, those are the common issues that I would see.
Amazing, thanks, Kevin. That wraps up all the questions that both I'd prepared and that we've been sent in or received through the Q&A. Do you have any final words of wisdom you'd like to leave us with?
So I actually think the integration between paid search and SEO is something that is quite often undervalued. And certainly from an SEO perspective, there's a lot that you can gain from PPC. So if you look at SEO in a silo, you can see, here's the market share visibility. These are the keywords that's driving traffic. Here's the search volume behind those keywords. Let's focus on this. If you look at the PPC performance, you can change that conversation from search volume to revenue. So going back to what we've been talking about all the way through this, of how do you get the board excited? It's quite simple. You change your search volume and you put a pound symbol in front of it. So if you can do that with your paid search data, and you can say, I always like to think there's an 80-20 rule for everything, and I don't think that's too far off. I think if you can say, okay, well, 80% of our revenue are coming from 20% of these, could be ad groups, it could be different URLs and pages, but these are the ones that we really want to focus on. How do we push that forward as much as possible? You then take that forecast from being traffic into revenue, and I think that's where paid search can really help, because paid search, I feel like from a board level perspective and from a percentage of spend perspective, SEO wise, I feel like you would typically, you might spend 10% of your paid search budget on SEO. But in terms of distribution of clicks, organic search in the past at least has definitely been quite a bit higher than the paid ad results. So it feels like the reason why paid search is winning is because it's so measurable, certainly in terms of the revenue that is being brought in. What I would say is there's an opportunity to bridge that gap. And I've never seen this as being an argument of SEO versus PPC. It's how do you make them work together in harmony? Because if it's profitable, spend as much as you can at the profit that makes sense to you as a business. But then how do you apply that same way of thinking with an SEO mindset in order to grow? So I do think when it comes to setting strategy, it's looking past the SEO tools and thinking about the integration of different channels and how that interplays much more closely. And it's putting the customer first. How do they interact and purchase, and then prioritize by value? And that value should be revenue, not search volume or traffic. So I think that's, to me, the key learning of how you can bring this together on the paid search and the SEO side is certainly in that sharing of data and the application of it.
Wonderful, thank you. And thanks so much for taking the time to answer both my questions and those that were sent in. And thank you to all the participants for both joining and sending the questions out. I think we just got another question sent in as well. So last one then, what link building tactics would you recommend, Kevin, if you have a low budget?
My first answer for that is, why do you need link building? And let's assume that you do need link building, but this is where I don't like to start a conversation in that way. I ask why and challenge people first. And if the answer to that is all things are equal on the other key areas of the site, our link reputation is lower than other competitors, and we think that's the big thing that moves the needle, then I feel like, okay, that's the right question. Let's focus on that question. But I do challenge people on, actually, are you looking at the right thing in the first place? Let's assume that in this case we definitely are, and this is the key thing you should be pushing forward. I think, again, it comes with analysis. I think quite often people can jump in too quickly and say, this would be a great idea, why don't we do this? But I would look at, why are our competitors ranking, and what type of links do they have that we think are moving the needle on their rankings? And I don't see enough link analysis and auditing done at this stage. I think people jump in very quickly because they're excited to do stuff, and I get that. I think it makes a lot of sense. You want to be taking action, absolutely, but you also want to be making sure that when you do that link building activity, it's going to work. So understand, and again, this comes back to, are you trying to catch someone? If you are, what is it that they're doing well? How do you learn from that? And what are the trends? So are there certain sites that they get links from? Maybe they're trade associations, maybe it's national media coverage, it could be very targeted, relevant blogs within that industry. But the more that you can understand about where they get their links from, the more you can then turn into a strategy of what you're going to do. And sometimes that could be very easy. Yeah, and it could just be a case of, how do you improve what you're doing? Other times, and this is why I'm starting by kind of challenging, there may be other ways to achieve it. It could be, how do you actually improve your own internal linking structure as opposed to seeking external links? There's different ways to do it, but I think typically if you have a larger budget, the approach is more digital PR, quite campaign led. I prefer the model which is, rather than, again, those campaign spikes, it's how do you add value? So what are the key topics that people are talking about? How do you target maybe top of funnel awareness phrases, and then build links more tactically into the pages that you think will perform? If you're building links into a domain and trying to improve the overall site's performance, that's when I think it can get really tricky to measure and prove the performance of that. So I think my answer, similar to how I answered the Expedia one earlier, was be focused around what you're trying to do, break it down, and then maybe you need less links than you think because you're being more tactical about what links you need and where they're going to in terms of the right places. So hopefully that helps. I would still advocate that even if you have a large budget. I think just throwing budget at links to improve the overall domain is, maybe it helps in some cases. I'm not saying it's completely irrelevant, but I think there's a smarter way to do it.
Great, thank you, and perfect timing because we're almost exactly out of time. Kevin, but you'll be sending a follow-up to this as well, won't you?
Yeah, exactly. So we'll send an email, I think probably tomorrow, with a bit of a recap. But yeah, thanks for everyone for joining.
Thank you, everybody, and have a nice day.